QIMR Berghofer acknowledges the traditional and cultural custodians of the lands, waters and seas across Queensland, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We support the cultural knowledge, determination and commitment of First Nations communities in caring for health and well-being for millennia.
Welcome to QIMR Berghofer's 80th anniversary podcast. I'm Clare Blake, and we're celebrating 8 decades of bold ideas, real science, and the brilliant men and women who made it happen. We did start in a leaky old army hut, and now we're tackling cancer, decoding the brain, tracking infectious diseases, and rewriting what's possible in medicine. We'll dive into the true stories, funny, messy, inspiring, from the people who made it all happen, and those carrying the torch into the future, because science isn't just labs and data, it's human, and it's happening right here. Well, today we're really honoured to be joined by Professor Michael Good, AO, distinguished immunologist and former director of QIMR Berghofer from 2000 to 2010. Professor, your leadership expanded the Institute's research horizons, established the Indigenous Health Research Program, the Australian Centre for Vaccine Development, and a new division of mental health research. This enormous commitment to advancing medical science earned numerous accolades, including the Officer of the Order of Australia 2008, and the Eureka Prize for Leadership in 2009. And we're really grateful that you're in here to help us celebrate 80 years. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you very much. A wonderful institute. I was so privileged to be able to work here and then ultimately become director of the institute. Always held it fondly in my thoughts since I really first heard about it. My former mentor, Chev Kidson, who was the fourth director of QIMR, he was my inaugural professor of biochemistry at the University of Queensland, and he appointed me here to a position after I'd finished my postdoc in America, and I had so much admiration for Chev, an unbelievable mind, great leader, did a lot for this place.
You're obviously aware of QIMR because of the Chev Kidson.
Yes, correct.
So what made you think you might like to have a career here?
Well, after my postdoc in America, and I was in a very good lab over there of Lou Miller, the world's foremost malariologist, where I learnt my malaria from Lou, having done a PhD in immunology. Chev, who'd become a very good colleague and mentor throughout that time I was in America, offered me a job. I was very chuffed. Quite a senior position too, I might add, and lab head coming back from a postdoc. I was very fortunate to get that. I had an offer to stay in America and be a vice president for a pharmaceutical company, but didn't really tick a lot of boxes for me. I mean, it would have made an awful lot of money, but I wanted my kids to grow up in Australia, and QIMR was a great place, and Chev had given me a job here, so that was easy.
You do have quite a few kids.
8.
The stories that we hear is Chev was particularly supportive of family people.
Chev was very supportive of families and staff who had children and women who had children trying to make it in the workforce. He was really ahead of his time in that respect, I think, but you're absolutely right.
All the same things we keep hearing about Chev. He really inspired people to really broaden the horizons. And it was that inspiration that made you so committed to expanding our remit here.
Yes, for sure. I mean, one of the things Chev did, if I can just sort of elaborate a little bit about Chev, this place was really part of the public service in the Queensland government. It had very good scientists, no question, but what Chev did was to take it out of that and make it a statutory body. So it has a different vibe to it. So it's no longer a 9 to 5 type of environment where the public service used to be in those days. The scientists had to have a different mindset, and they did. The same scientists, as I observed, became more competitive, more interested in science, and this place grew as a result of what Chev had done.
What was your first day like?
First day at QIMR, I was in the old building, the building up in the back there on Bramson Terrace. It was interesting building. Chev was there. Mick Barry was there. I think Mick was his secretary of the institute, maybe the chief operating officer at the time, or it might have been Ian Taylor at that time too. We had pretty sort of ramshackle sort of facilities over there. Sometimes, the mice cages are in your actual lab or whatever. Totally different world to what science is now in terms of regulations. It was fun though. It was a good environment. We did things that need to be done, and we did them. You didn't seek too much permission to do things. The view that, it's better to seek forgiveness and seek permission. And things got done. The director was always around the place. You knew where he was. He'd drop in and talk to you and have discussions about science. Chev was a great director because the thing that excited him, apart from the people who was working for him, the thing that excited him the most was science. And he just loved science. And he was one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And he is so widely read, not just in science, and many aspects of life. I mean, it was Chev who really got me interested in working in China. He said, look, you must go to China. Very different China to what it is now. This is back in 1989, and not long after Tiananmen. I was over there, instead of seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of cars going down the streets, they're all bicycles, of course. Australia was reluctant in those days. It wasn't that long post-Gulf Whitlam, but Australia was reluctant to embrace China. To be honest, of course, they are still today to a large extent. But Chev opened his arms to China, and he had a lot of Chinese scientists would come here, and he spent a lot of time in China himself. He could see there's an opportunity there, but he also saw people in China in those days had a lot of disease, which medical research is supposed to be addressing. It made a whole lot of sense. Fortunately for me, to have that sort of inspiration from Chev, I've been to China many, many times, and we have existing wonderful collaborations with China. One of my best, I have a number of best postdocs, but one of my very good postdocs, Suji Zhu, spent 10 years in the lab here with me at QIMR studying malaria T cells. He went back to China and got a job in the Second Military Medical University in Shanghai. I noticed, and I've been speaking to him since, of course, but last year he was named in the top 10 scientists by Nature in the world for 2024, not just in medicine, in all realms of science, all realms of science. Huji is a QIMR alumnus, no question about that. He may well be on the track to getting a Nobel Prize. He's discovered a way to develop an off-the-shelf treatment for autoimmune diseases like SLE and so on. And it's phenomenal. I mean, he's just a great, great scientist. And I had the pleasure of having him as a postdoc in my lab for 10 years. But, QIMR's got to be very proud of him.
Was it just luck, or did he have a good mentor?
Well, that's a very good question. And look, both those things are important. Luck, mentorship, hard work. I've been lucky in all those respects, and I think Huji was in a great environment here at QIMR. I'd like to think I gave him some mentorship, but he's a smart man.
You came at a time when the world was changing in terms of communication and the internet. How did it change before that and after that?
Really good question. I mean, with communication opening up, it's made a huge difference to cities like Brisbane. No question, has got very, very good scientists. It was never a big hub of science. Talking back the 80s now, right, for example, whereas Melbourne was a great hub of science. Great leaders like Gus Nossel built up the science down there. But because they're all essentially cheek to jowl, communication and collaboration was easy to develop in Melbourne. It was harder for us up here because we are a smaller critical mass. Not that we weren't any less intelligent or less hardworking, just a smaller critical mass. So we'd meet people from Melbourne and so on by going to conferences, phone them, or you read their work in the journals. But, it's very different to having people right beside you. But now with modern communication, internet, Zoom meetings, Teams or whatever, the world is a small place and Australia is a very much smaller place. So if I look back now, I'd say, well, what's actually driven the growth of Queensland science, which is now much, much more competitive than it was 30 years ago? I think it's in large part due, not entirely, but in large part due to communication. The other thing that drove Queensland biomedical science, of course, was the constellation coming together with Chuck Feeney and the Queensland government of Peter Beattie and later Anna Bligh. Chuck Feeney just appeared on our doorstep out of the blue, not quite out of the blue. Ken Fletcher was a very good mate of his. They were a great tennis player, of course, and they're business colleagues in Hong Kong. The longer story is that Chuck came to former Premier Wayne Goss to do something for Ken Fletcher, and I built a major tennis facility. And I don't know the whole detail of that story, of course, but the Premier at the time was not terribly interested. I can say that. Anyway, 10 years later, a different Premier, Chuck thought he'd try again, and this time it was Peter Beattie. Chuck wanted to do a few things. He wanted to invest in medical research, but he also wanted to do something for tennis and for Ken Fletcher. I'm not so across the tennis part of the story anymore, but what Chuck did in the 1990s was to come here and say to the government, I will contribute a lot of money if you can match it. And Peter Beattie had the vision and the gumption to go to his cabinet and say, listen, this guy wants to give us $20 million, money for QIMR, money for University of Queensland, on the condition that the Queensland government matches it. But I can't tell you, talking to his cabinet, I can't tell you who that person is. Beattie, through his leadership, was able to convince his cabinet to accept that money, and he did. And that's what started Chuck's investment in Australian biomedical research here and at University of Queensland at the same time. But that was only the first of many, many donations. Another interesting story about Chuck. Chuck is a very modest man, very, very well-read he was. He's no longer with us, of course. He'd typically travel with in a paper bag might have the latest issue of New York newspapers or Washington newspapers, but also the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet. He was across so many things, very interested in science and medicine. And he came up wearing his baggy corduroys, I think, and plaid shirt to the 13th floor of the executive building where the Premier was. He had a meeting with the Premier. Came up there and the guard said to him, who are you here to meet? He said, I'm here to meet the Premier. The guy said, oh, no, you're not. And then he sent him down to the street. Beattie came out of his office and said, is there a man here looking for me? And the guard was very upset, of course, because he sent him down to the street. So Peter Beattie got in the express elevator and went down and pulled him off the street, pulled him off George Street and took him back to his office. But if that hadn't have happened, we would have missed out the second time for getting funding for Queensland. But it started here at QIMR and the University of Queensland, as I said, and it spread. More money to QIMR eventually. That's another story. I had the great fortune to be involved in. More money for UQ, money for QUT. Then it was spread down south, but it all started in Queensland. So that was a very important time for us. We had an opportunity, I don't think it'll ever happen again, where someone just comes essentially out of the blue and says, I want to give a lot of money to build infrastructure, as long as state government and then eventually the federal government match it.
Extraordinary times. This was in the beginning of your directorship of QIMR?
Well, the first person that Chuck had interactions was with Laurie Powell. And Laurie was a great director before me. He was a person who really brought in what they call translational research. He was the first person I'm aware of to use that term. It's now permeated throughout all of his Australian biomedical research, translational research. In other words, taking something from the clinic to the bedside, and Laurie would say from the bedside back to the clinic. And Laurie was a champion of that. So he was the person who Chuck first interacted with, getting funds for a new building here at QIMR. That started the great friendship with Chuck, which lasted a decade or more. My interaction with Chuck was for the second new building. There used to be the old outpatients hospital, Royal Brisbane Hospital building down there, which the government didn't want anymore. And they sort of said, well, if you got the money, you can use that building. It had to be torn down. It was useless for anything, for medical research. And I've never asked anybody for money at all. But when Chuck came here, when I met him for the third time, I was met him for the third time, I thought, well, I don't like asking people for money, but it was clear he wanted to do something. So I said, Chuck, would you like me to develop a business plan for redeveloping that old building into another building, a QIMR medical research building? He said, that'd be a good idea, Michael. That was my cue to actually write a business plan where he was factored into contributing to the money. But of course, that money only came with money from the Queensland government as well, and the federal government. And so the federal government had some politics to deal with, because now they're giving money to QIMR sort of out of the blue. So Kevin Rudd had to invent a way to make it all look sort of kosher, and it was kosher, of course. He put out some sort of application for funding, but I don't know how many people were allowed to apply for it. I know we were. I know Chuck was entertained at the lodge in Canberra with the Prime Minister. I remember at the time Chuck telling me, Chuck had two buildings he wanted to build, one here and one at QUT at that same time. And the Prime Minister, this is what I've heard not from the Prime Minister, I heard from Chuck. Chuck was told, well, what's your preference, Chuck? Can you sort of rank these projects, either QIMR or QUT or QUT? We need some sort of ranking, because, the unspoken word was we've only got funds for one of those buildings, and, we want you to tell me where you want to put the money. Chuck refused. He said, you either fund them both or none. And he stood by it. The Prime Minister blinked. Chuck got money for both of them.
So clever.
Mm.
And all this time, you still had to keep Chuck's name out of everything.
Exactly. I mean, there was a time when it became public. Chuck refused to have his name on any building. So Clive Berghofer was a donor to the Institute, a very good donor, of course. didn't give us contribute as much as Chuck at the time. I understand he's given a lot more money since I've left here. So this new building that Chuck had funded, he said, why don't you try and get naming rights to that building? I don't want my name, Chuck's name on it. Perhaps Mr. Berghofer would put his name on it. So we approached Clive Berghofer, of course, and Clive Berghofer, very generous man. He said, yes, thank you very much. So that's how we got the Clive Berghofer name on the building. Then Clive Berghofer then developed a much longer and important collaboration with the Institute after my time. I've got another story I can tell you about the initial money for the building. So we needed more money for one of the buildings in 2000 or thereabouts. And I'd recently become director. I'd recently discovered that I had a half-brother who I didn't know about before, which is another story in its own right. But the half-brother turned out to be George Brandis, who was a senator in the federal government. He became, as you probably would know, he became Attorney General. George was a new senator, and John Howard, of course, was Prime Minister at that time. But we were looking for funds to develop one of these buildings. We didn't have quite enough money. So Bruce Watson, who was an amazing chairman of council, I've never had a seat of chairman as wonderful as Sir Bruce. Sensible man, common sense, very well read, very well connected, very generous of his time and everything. I said to Bruce, I've got this brother now who's a new senator, and maybe he can make an introduction because it's the right party, Liberal Party. When I say right, I mean the same party. But maybe he can make an introduction to the Prime Minister, because Bruce knew John Howard. Bruce used to be the chairman of Mount Isa Mines in North Queensland, which used to be Queensland's biggest company. So Bruce is very well known, and the Prime Minister knew Bruce from that time too, but he hadn't seen him in a long while. I'll come back to that. I said to George, listen, George, our chairman knows or used to know the Prime Minister through business, and we're wondering whether we could come to Canberra, just have a chat with the Prime Minister, see if there's any funds that the government can make available to QIMR. So George says, yes, that'd be great. So we go down there and we meet George, introduce George to Sir Bruce, and we walk around to the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister is coming out of his room, and he happens to see Bruce. And he hadn't seen Bruce in, I think, 10 or 20 years. And he has a phenomenal memory, John Howard did. And he said to Sir Bruce, oh, Sir Bruce, what are you doing here? And Sir Bruce is looking a little bit, sort of taken a bit back. He said, well, we're here to meet you. He said, oh no, that's not in my diary. That's next week. So George had got the wrong day in the diary. It's actually worked out it was a great mistake to make, because to John Howard's credit, he said, well, come in anyway. Look, I've got a few minutes. So we go into the Prime Minister's office. So he says, well, why don't you tell the Prime Minister in a few words what you want the money for? So I had some sort of, brief presentation. I spoke for about 30 seconds. It seemed like probably forever. And John says, oh, that's lovely, wonderful. Thank you all for coming in. He looked at George. I don't think he was happy with George because George got the day wrong. I'm sure they made up afterwards. Anyway, as it turned out, the timing was perfect. It was a Tuesday, and that's when the Liberal Party have their party meetings in the party room. So John Howe left our meeting and went straight into the party room meeting, and they were discussing what to do with the Queensland Bicentennial Fund. So we had a $20 million, I think. We might have got $20 million. We had $20 million in the Queensland Bicentennial Fund, which hadn't been spent because the Labor Lord Mayor of Brisbane, Jim Sawley, and Peter Beattie, the Labor Premier, as I understand it, couldn't come to an agreement on how to spend this money. It was set aside for Queensland, but they couldn't come to an agreement on how to spend the money in Queensland because I think they had differences of opinion about a few things, and that was one of them. And John Howard, playing politics, sort of, I guess, sort of knew this. And he said to the group party room, well, we've got this money for Queensland. How would you like to spend it? And one guy put this, I heard this from George. One guy put his hand up and said, well, the bridge over my local river floods all the time, up somewhere out in the outback. Could we get a new bridge? In other words, benefiting him. Another guy says, well, our town library is so old it needs to be rebuilt. Can we get a new library? Good for him. And a few other suggestions around that, and no one could come to an agreement. Then John Howard says, well, I've had these two guys from Queensland who reckon they can cure cancer. What do you think? Oh, yes. We'll give them the money for QIMR to cure cancer. So that's how we got the $20 million.
So George's poor calendar skills got you the money.
Yes, if George has listened to this, I apologise, George, if I got that not 100% right, but I think that's how it went.
You get the right of reply, George. Terrific story. So when you came in as director, obviously these government relations are crucial in expanding the work that you were doing here. As you walked in the door as the new director, what were you thinking? What were your fears? What were your challenges? And what was the plan?
So that's a very good question. So I had my only experience in being a director of anything was a director of a cooperative research centre, which wasn't a small thing, but it wasn't like an institute. Brought together half a dozen, in 8 days, 5 medical research and CSIRO organisations around the country to develop vaccines. So I had a little bit of experience in running a show. Fortunately, we had Sir Bruce as chair of that. I knew Bruce quite well. So stepping into the role of director of QIMR wasn't like coming into something completely foreign to me. And I knew the institute, of course. I've been here since 1988. It was now 2000, so I knew the staff pretty well. But I told this joke against myself, not a joke, it's a true story. There were 2 applicants for the job that I applied to as director of QIMR. Originally, they wanted Elizabeth Blackburn, who won a Nobel Prize for telomeres. She came out here, which would have been great. She's Australian, but was living in California and doing wonderful research. It took whatever, best part of a year, and she ultimately declined. I think they also wanted Peter Beattie, but I don't think Peter was ever interested in becoming director of QIMR. He's a Queenslander, another Nobel laureate, famous person. I think he'd had enough of running shows. He wanted to do his own science, which was great for him. But so Peter was never going to be a director. But so then they said, well, we need a director. So they advertised and I applied. I had applied originally, unbeknownst I go to approach Elizabeth Blackburn. And then another person applied. There were 20 people in the old QIMR boardroom. Interview was fine. It went on for a while. Well, it's clear that it was difficult. From what I heard from the driver who took Sue of the interviewing panel to the airport, that was Barry. Barry said, "Oh, Michael, you got the job." I said, "Oh, thanks very much." And I heard later on also that they was split 10-all. Me and the other chap. I won't mention the other chap's name. A lot of people know who it was. He would have been very good, I have no doubt. The 10 on the board who were from outside Queensland voted for me, and the 10 on the board who were Queenslanders voted for the other guy. Then they had to get somehow to split the vote. I believe they approached Gus Nossel and Peter Doherty to see what they thought, and I got the job. I was lucky to get the job. Anyway, so my first day on the job, I was sort of aware of half of this sort of stuff, and Bruce said to me, you haven't had any proper formal sort of business training. And that's true, absolutely true, apart from my experience on the ground with the CRC, which I did for 7 years. So Bruce said, go to Melbourne for 2 weeks and do a business course. And you're doing a business course with people sort of like me who have been made CEOs or whatever, but had very little business experience from all walks of life, I learned a couple of things, and how to make pizza was one of them. Perhaps the more important thing I learned was the importance of rewarding excellence. Rather than saying, oh, you've done a good job, we'll give you a Christmas bonus. They said, that's not the way to reward excellence. If you want to reward excellence properly, reward it at the time when it happens, because it reinforces in the person's mind that activity of which they were excellent at leads to a reward. It's Pavlovian. You train the human mind that way. So I came back from Melbourne and said, Bruce, I think we should have a bonus scheme. Now, Labor government didn't like the word bonus, and that it was a government-appointed board, of course, but we had another name for it. It took actually 2 years to get that permission for that bonus scheme through the government, but that's okay. They approved in the end, to their great credit. It was totally objective. This is for the academic staff. The non-academic staff had a different system, which was basically interaction with a 360 interview with people above, below you. But for the academic staff, it was totally transparent. It based on the publications that you made in particular journals which were a certain rank, and whether you were the senior author, or the first author, or the last author, or whatever. I was driven by the fact that I knew that our staff could publish in journals better than they were publishing in. When you publish in the top tier journals like the Natures and the Science and the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, that's what attracts a grant. That's what attracts the interest of people around the world, and it gives you funding into the institute. So I said, look, I know our staff can publish in these journals, but they're taking lower journals, and people aren't recognizing their work. I said, if you publish in these journals, we will give you an amount of money, cash, which you can either take as salary and pay tax on it, or you can put it into your lab and use it to fund student scholarships, going to conferences, science-related stuff. It was very successful. So the other thing that drove me, I came from WeHi as a student, and I knew our staff were as good as those guys down in Melbourne, but they weren't publishing as many journals. So we used to publish almost average 15 what I call high impact factor journals per year. I did my research for the last 5 or 10 years. WeHi was publishing 30 or 40, if not more. But over 3 years, we saw our impact factor number of those journals go from 15 to 50, and it exceeded WeHi, my alma mater in Melbourne, and I was so pleased about that. That was the thing that was really driving me. And also making sure our staff were well recognised. So, for example, a first author paper would be given in a top journal, you'd get 20,000 or 10,000, a lot of money. It wasn't a pittance. And we were spending $200,000 on bonuses. So where did the money come from to pay for that? As I mentioned, when you publish in better journals, you get more grants.
Yeah.
Everything worked together for us because up until that time, the grant money could not be used to run the institute. It could only be used for the science in the lab. It wouldn't go for salaries, non-academic salary. It wouldn't go to turn the lights on, pay the rates, anything like that. But fortunately, at that time, I'd been elected president of the Australian Association of Medical Research Institutes, AMRI. And people before me, not just me, but I was in the seat for 2 years at this critical time. I was in a position to lobby the government of the day, which was the Health Minister, Tony Abbott. So look, the universities get overheads for their grants. We get nothing. We have to rely on donations and fundraising and that sort of thing. We did get a grant from the Queensland government, of course, but that wasn't enough. So over a period of a year or two, the government agreed to give us 20% of the NHMRC grants to the institutes, not just QMR, but I was representing all the institutes, to all the institutes around Captain, about 30 or 40 of them. And that was life-saving for the institutes because they can now afford to actually open their doors and have good libraries and have better support staff and all this sort of stuff. We had enough money to pay the staff for their publications. Their publications made our grant income go from $5 million a year from NHMRC to $30 million over a period of 3 or 4 years. That $30 million generated 20% of that is, $6 million to the institute, and we were paying out $200,000 in bonuses to the staff. So the institute had a win-win. The staff were happier, a lot happier.
Mm-hmm.
The institute was publishing much more high-quality journals, and the books were balanced. That hadn't been written into the constitution, you might say, of QIMR, but I believe it is now. I believe it's embedded.
For somebody who didn't have much experience, you certainly made an impact. And this really plays into the things that we keep hearing from other scientists about their time with you, the incredible support of their work, the philanthropic ideas, and thinking much bigger than had been thought before. What was your proudest achievement of that time as director?
I think the proudest achievement, getting staff recognition was one of my most proud achievements. But in terms of the program of the place, I've always been committed to Aboriginal health and mental health. Not my own areas of, it's not quite true. I work on streptococcal disease and rheumatic heart disease, which directly affects Aboriginal people. But to get those two divisions embedded within the institute, that took some negotiating with council, getting Michael Breakspear up, for example, to head the mental health research division. That was wonderful. And the beautiful work that he did. He's now left, unfortunately, I understand. And getting Gail Garvey, who's now at UQ, senior leadership position over there, to head the Indigenous Health Program here. I was extremely proud of those achievements. So they meant a lot to me. And there's another few things I'm proud of, but one of them I could mention is the Institute Fellowships. We started the scheme to employ on 5-year fixed-term fellowships young, brilliant scientists who we thought would have a big future in medical research and be ultimately self-funding and drive their own programs, run their own labs and so on. So we started a 5-year program to fund them and fund them well on the condition that within that 5-year period, they were going to get their own fellowships and fund themselves going into the future. It started very well and ended well. 3 people who I can recall, Alex Lucas, who was here for many years, now up in North Queensland, Chris Angwerda, who's an absolute powerhouse of malaria immunology here now, and Michael Breakspear. So there were 3 people, and there have been others as well. Being able to build up the base of researchers has been so important to me. The other thing I'm probably sort of proud of, because people's often ask me, and sometimes councils would often ask me, I mean, how are you looking after the Institute? What are you doing to look after the Institute? That sort of general question. And I have a very simple answer to that. I always have had. From the very beginning, I said, well, the way to look after the Institute is to look after its staff and students. All they want is to do better science. That's all they want. They don't want anything big and grandiose themselves. They want to do better science. But they'll have things that they need to do that. So you look after the staff and students and show them respect and show them they're listened to, they will look after the Institute for you. And that's been sort of like a mantra that I've always followed. So I'd never read sort of policy documents for the Institute. I wouldn't know. I mean, I was there when they were written, but I've never, ever referred to them.
Scientists from here have become very famous, but are there some that don't get the accolades that they deserve?
One comes to mind, Claire, and that's Greg Lawrence. So Greg was here, I think, when I first came here as a physician by training. He spent a lot of his time in New Guinea. He developed a vaccine for a condition that most people had never heard of. It's called pigbel. Pigbel occurs when native tribes in New Guinea would have a feast for a big event, and they would, say, for example, kill a pig. They would get a lot of protein into their system, but these people typically had a very poor diet. They would often have a lot of, for example, sweet potato in their diet. What Greg worked out, he didn't discover pigbel. He worked out how it's caused and developed a vaccine. What pigbel is when you are either in the meat that you eat or in your own intestine, you've got a germ called Clostridium perfringens. It's been renamed to that. It wasn't called that in Greg's day. I think it was called Clostridium welchii. It produces a toxin, and that toxin damages your gut. The body contains proteases which can destroy, like trypsin, which can destroy that toxin. But when you have a poor diet and when you, for example, don't cook the sweet potato, which is the antidote, properly, the trypsin isn't destroyed and the toxin basically takes over. So he worked out how that process works. It's a deadly disease and people would die of pigbel. It's caused by a toxin from Clostridium, and he made a vaccine for it, and it works. And it works. And that story isn't told much these days. It was told a little bit when I was here, but I don't ever think Greg ever got the proper credit he deserved for that. He developed a vaccine which prevented that disease.
Lots of things have happened here over the years, and you're behind lots of them. A very proud history here. We were so lucky to have you for that time. It's a long time to be a director. It's so great to hear your stories. Happy 80th anniversary.
Thanks very much, Claire. Thanks very much for the interview.